The opening scene of the movie introduces us to a scuba diver, struggling to open an old chest that is covered with rocks. As he succeeds in doing so, a boat on the surface is lowering a heavy pipe into the water above him. Unfortunately, one of the chains breaks and pins him to the bottom, just as the chest opens and an ancient mask floats free of the chest and rises to the surface. We are then taken to a bank where we meet Stanley Ipkiss, a bank employee, talking to another employee called Maggie. His workmate Charlie informs him that Peggy is taking advantage of him, so he decides to take Stanley out on the town. As they are about to leave, it starts raining and a beautiful woman named Tina enters the bank. Both Stanley and Charlie can't help but stare at her, and Charlie takes her to Stanley's desk to talk about opening a new account. While Tina is flirting with Stanley, a hidden camera in her handbag is taking a video of the main vault. In an office elsewhere, two men, Dorian and Freeze, are watching the video, planning to rob the bank. Freeze reminds Dorian that they need their boss, Nico's, approval, but Dorian informs him that things are going to change, and he will be taking over the operations. Later, Stanley visits a car workshop run by two junkie mechanics, and they lend him a car known as the Loner, as his car is not ready. That night, Stanley arrives at the Coco Club in the Loner, an old beat-up wreck. He meets Charlie with two girls outside the club, and Charlie pays Bobby the bouncer to get them in. However, Bobby does not let Stanley in, throwing him into the gutter. Just then, Tina arrives and Stanley is embarrassed, so he leaves in the Loner, leaving a trail of smoke. Stanley drove onto a bridge, where the Loner suddenly broke down. He walked to the side of the bridge and saw a body floating in the water, so he ran down to help only to discover it was just a pile of floating rubbish. But in the rubbish he found a strange wooden-looking mask. Stanley returned home dripping wet and was scolded by the landlady, Mrs. Peenman. As he entered his apartment, his dog Milo jumped up to greet him. Stanley then saw an interview with Dr. Newman on TV about people wearing masks to hide their true personality. Milo seemed disturbed by the mask and Stanley picked it up to take a closer look. Suddenly the mask attached itself to Stanley's face, and he started to spin around the room like a tornado. When he stopped, he had been transformed into some strange character with a green face, the mask. He walked down the hallway near Mrs. Peenman's door, and all of a sudden an animated clock leaped out of his pocket. He attempted to hit it with a huge mallet, and Mrs. Peenman immediately came out of her room, screamed, and attempted to shoot him. He bounced down the hallway and jumped out of the window. He landed on the road below, completely flat. He peeled himself off the road and a car honked its horn at him, so he returned the gesture by blasting his tiny horn back at the car, resulting in the windscreen exploding. He then continued walking down the street and was soon confronted by a street gang who were trying to rob him. He ran away from them and found an alley to hide in. When the gang found him, he was performing balloon tricks which fascinated them, until he transformed one into a machine gun and started shooting at them. He decides to take matters into his own hands and visit the car workshop to take care of the two mechanics. However, what he has done to them remains a mystery to us as of yet. The next morning, Stanley woke up in his bed, the events of the previous night a quickly fading memory. He rushed to the mirror, convinced that it had all been a dream. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Lieutenant Mitch Kellaway, a detective inquiring about the disturbance from the night before. Stanley denied hearing anything, but from the description the detective gave, Stanley realized that it was not a dream after all. Glancing at the clock, Stanley realized he was going to be late for work. Before he could leave, he threw the mask out the window, not noticing it flying back in as he departed. At the car workshop, two mechanics were being wheeled out to an ambulance with car exhaust pipes protruding from their backsides. A woman reporter named Peggy slipped in to do some investigating of her own. Stanley arrived at work to find Charlie asking him where he had gone the night before, and the bank manager asking why he had been late. Peggy, a reporter, then came in to ask Stanley some questions about the car workshop incident. She told him that there were hundreds of women looking for an honest and decent person like him, and gave him her card with her personal number on it before leaving. Meanwhile, Dorian went to visit his boss, Nico, and it seemed like Nico knew Dorian's plan to take over, so he told him to leave town or else he would be taken care of the next time. Stanley then went back to his apartment and fell asleep, dreaming about Tina. When he woke up, he found that Milo had been licking his ear. Seeing a newspaper clipping of Tina singing at the Coco Club, Stanley got an idea and put on the mask, transforming into the mask. Dorian's gang had a plan to rob the bank, but their efforts were foiled when the mask burst through the doors with bags of money. The police arrived soon after, leaving Dorian's gang scrambling. Later, a limousine pulled up to the Coco Club, and out stepped the mask, who proceeded to flick money into the air. Inside the club, Tina was singing and dancing, and the mask was enthralled. He spun his way up to the band, getting them to pump up the music, and then the two of them were dancing around the club, with the mask spinning Tina up and down. Dorian and his gang had arrived with news of someone who had taken all of the money from the bank. Sweet Eddie pointed to a figure wearing a mask and identified them as the culprit, prompting Orlando, one of Nico's thugs, to shoot at them. Despite their efforts, the figure managed to escape, putting on a dramatic show of death before fleeing. Lieutenant Calloway and a squad of police arrived shortly after, arresting both Dorian and Orlando. Among the items left behind by the thief was a piece of Stanley's pajama shirt. The next morning, Stanley was still asleep in his bed wearing striped pajamas when Calloway came knocking. In a rush to answer the door, Stanley quickly stashed away the bank money, which had been left in the closet, and proceeded to answer the door. Calloway asked questions regarding the bank robbery and the masked figure, while Milo attempted to open the closet. At the police station, Calloway and Officer Doyle are watching the bank's security footage of the robbery. Dorian is seen talking to a group of thugs, offering them a reward of $50,000 for the mask. He then turns his attention to Tina, questioning her about her kiss with the mask, which reveals his envy. Back at the bank, Stanley enters as the police are investigating and is met by the bank manager who scolds him for being late. Instead of cowering, though, Stanley stands up for himself and the manager retreats. Charlie speaks to Stanley and Tina soon after, asking about the mask. She appears to be taken with him, and Stanley suggests he can arrange a meeting. She kisses his cheek and then leaves. The next day, Stanley took the mask to see Dr. Newman, who informed him that it resembled the mythical mask of Loki, the Norse god of mischief. Stanley attempted to demonstrate the power of the mask, but nothing happened, and Dr. Newman concluded Stanley was a wacko, telling him that he and the mask were one and the same, just to get him to leave. Stanley then caught a taxi and was under surveillance by Calloway and Doyle. When he arrived at the park, he met up with Tina, but felt awkward, so he said he would leave before the mask arrived. He ran behind some bushes and emerged from the other side as the mask, attempting to kiss Tina, who then kneed him in the crotch. At that moment, Calloway, Doyle, and some cops appeared, arresting the mask. Peggy had just heard from her boss, Murray, that the police had caught Stanley. She pleaded with her boss to let her go, and he obliged. When she arrived at the park, she saw two police officers searching the mask and uncovering various items, including a photo of Calloway's wife. The mask was able to switch the handcuffs between Calloway and Doyle and run away. He barricaded the gates, only to be met with a sea of guns from the police officers. Suddenly, the mysterious figure was dressed in a flamenco costume and performing an elaborate dance. The cops surprisingly began singing and dancing along. Eventually, Calloway and Doyle were able to climb out of the park and break up the fun. The mask ran down an alley, with the cops in pursuit. Just in the nick of time, Peggy pulled up in her car, calling for Stanley. He jumped in the car and they sped away, as the cops shot after them. Stanley and Peggy are sitting in the warehouse talking. Peggy tells Stanley how much she cares for him, but in reality, she has sold him out to Dorian for $50,000, and his thugs have arrived to take Stanley up to the printing machinery to force him to tell Dorian how to use the mask. Dorian puts on the mask and turns into a super criminal. Dorian's thugs then take Stanley to his apartment to get the bank money. Orlando and another thug go through the closet to get the money, while Milo watches. Seeing Stanley in the car, Milo follows them, and they drive past the police station and throws Stanley out onto Calloway. Calloway brings Stanley inside and locks him up in a cell. Meanwhile, Milo is lurking outside in the alley. Tina comes to the station to visit Stanley and admits that she really likes him, and not the mask. When Tina leaves, Dorian's thugs chase after her and Stanley witnesses it. Tina is soon found by Dorian in an alley, and he takes her away in his car. Not wanting to let Tina go, Stanley gets Milo to jump up to the cell window and unlocks the door by retrieving the keys. Through his quick thinking, Stanley manages to escape the police station, taking the officer's gun with him. Calloway soon enters the scene and Stanley handcuffs himself to him, and they leave the station to find Tina. At this point, they arrive at the Coco Bongo Club, which is owned by Dorian's boss Nico. Mayor Tilton and other members of the city are present to raise money for the War Orphans Fund, and Charlie is also there, enjoying the festivities. But the party is soon disrupted when Dorian, wearing the mask, breaks down the doors of the club with his gang, and a gun battle erupts between Nico and his men. In an attempt to kill Dorian, Nico shoots at him, but the mask protects him, and he fires the bullets from his mouth. Back at Nico, ultimately killing him. Outside the club, Stanley pulled up and left Kellaway handcuffed in the car with Milo. He then entered the club armed with a gun, knocking out one of the thugs and taking his gun. Stanley then found Charlie and gave him the gun. Stanley then saw Dorian, who was wearing a mask, tying up Tina to an artificial coconut tree and setting explosives to go off in 10 minutes. Orlando, another thug, then caught Stanley and took him to Dorian. Meanwhile, Milo managed to unlock the door and headed for the club. Tina then came up with an idea. She asked Dorian for one last kiss with him, but not with the mask. She wanted to kiss the old Dorian she was in love with, so he removed his mask and kissed her. As he was kissing her, Tina was able to free one of her legs and kick the mask across the room. Everyone then scrambled to grab the mask, but it was Milo that jumped up and grabbed it. Stanley then told Milo to run and tried to untie Tina, but Dorian quickly got into a fight with him. As Sweet Eddie grabbed Milo's legs, Milo put on the mask and transformed into a fierce little dog. Stanley knocked out Dorian and called Milo. He removed the mask from Milo, and Orlando shot at the mask, sending it flying behind a bar. They opened fire on the bar, but the mask emerged unscathed, with 2 handfuls of fake guns and rocket launchers. Orlando and the other 2 quickly ran away. Knowing the explosives were about to detonate, Tina called out to the mask, and he was there in a flash, swallowing the explosives, which went off in his stomach. He belched out some smoke and fire, but was okay. Dorian then pulled out a knife, but Milo barked to warn the mask, who painted a toilet flush on the tree, flushing Dorian away into a pond. Stanley removed the mask, but before he could kiss Tina, Charlie arrived with the police to arrest the thugs. Outside the club, Kellaway was about to arrest Stanley, but he bumped into Mayor Tilton. Kellaway told the mayor that Stanley was the mask, but the mayor corrected him, saying that it was Dorian, not Stanley. He elaborated, saying that he saw it with his own eyes, and that Stanley was a hero for saving them all from Dorian and his men. We then saw Stanley, Tina, Charlie and Milo drive onto a bridge and Tina threw the mask back into the river, then gave Stanley a passionate kiss. Charlie had ideas of his own. Despite Milo's warnings, he decided to take matters into his own hands and jumped into the river in pursuit of the mask. Unfortunately, Milo was faster and managed to swim off with the mask before Charlie could reach it. Thanks for watching, I really appreciate it. If you liked this video, please remember to like and subscribe to watch more videos like this. Additionally, don't forget to turn on your notifications so that you can be updated when I release new videos. Doing so will help my channel a lot, so thank you for your support.